Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves in ancient Egypt, not building pyramids or worshipping gods, but elbow deep in something far smellier. The daily nightmare of wrapping dead bodies with a stomach that really wishes we worked somewhere else. Drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I always love seeing this little time-traveling community gathering here from all over the world. Now, dim the lights, tuck yourself in, and let's drift far, far away. You wake up in ancient Egypt. The first thing that hits you isn't the blazing sun or the majestic pyramids gleaming in the distance. No, it's the smell. Holy Horus. The smell. It's like someone took a butcher shop, doused it in cheap perfume, set it on fire, then buried it under a mountain of cinnamon and regret. And congratulations, this is your workplace. You're Kenty, because of course your parents named you after a funeral god. Talk about being typecast from birth. You're the lowest ranking apprentice at the House of Purification. Think of it as the ancient Egyptian equivalent of being the intern who has to clean the deep fryer at a fast food joint. Except instead of old oil and chicken nuggets, you're dealing with human organs and the existential weight of eternal damnation if you screw up someone's afterlife. Your job description would read something like this. If ancient Egypt had HR departments, seeking detail-oriented individual, comfortable with bodily fluids, strong stomach preferred, but not required, must be able to work in high-stress environment with deceased clientele and judgmental priests. Benefits include constant nausea, social isolation, and the lingering scent of death that no amount of bathing can remove. The irony? You have the weakest stomach in all of Memphis. We're talking about someone who gags at the smell of overripe dates. And here you are, elbow deep in the ancient equivalent of a medical examiner's worst nightmare, trying to make dead people Instagram ready for the afterlife. Your day starts at dawn, because apparently the dead don't believe in sleeping in. You stumble out of your mud brick hovel, which you share with two other apprentices, a family of mice, and what you're pretty sure is a ghost that keeps moving your sandals. You immediately know it's going to be a rough day. How? The wind is blowing from the direction of the embalming workshop, carrying with it the sweet, sickly aroma of yesterday's project. You grab your breakfast, a chunk of bread that could double as a building material, and some beer that tastes like it was filtered through a pharaoh's gym socks. You try to eat while mentally preparing for what lies ahead. It's like doing shot-for-shot prep for a horror movie, except the horror movie is your actual life, and the shots are just warm, flat beer. The walk to work takes you past the normal people of Memphis, going about their normal lives. Bakers baking bread, lucky bastards. Potters making pots, at least clay doesn't rot. Scribes scribbling hieroglyphs. Paper cuts are nothing compared to what you deal with. They all give you a wide berth. Because, let's be honest, you smell like death's armpit, and that's on a good day. You arrive at the House of Purification. A building that looks innocuous enough from the outside, just another stone structure, with some fancy columns and hieroglyphs promising eternal bliss. But step inside, and it's like entering the world's most sacred slaughterhouse. The main hall is divided into several rooms. The preparation chamber, where the magic happens. The drying room, where bodies hang out for 40 days, like the world's most depressing meat locker. Storage rooms, for supplies, jars, linen, and enough natron salt to de-ice the roads of a modern city. And the priest's quarters, where the higher-ups retreat when things get too real. Speaking of higher-ups, let's talk about the workplace dynamics in this death factory. At the top, you have the chief embalmer, Hemiorno, a man so important he probably doesn't even remember what actual dead bodies smell like anymore. He glides around in linen so white it hurts to look at, wearing enough jewelry to fund a small kingdom, dispensing wisdom about preserving the divine essence, while staying a comfortable distance from anything that might stain his manicure. Below him are the senior priests, who handle the spiritual aspects of mummification. Translation: they burn incense, chant impressive-sounding prayers, and make sure the canopic jars are blessed properly. While you do all the actual work, they wear these elaborate masks during ceremonies, ostensibly for religious reasons, but you suspect it's really just a fancy way to avoid the smell. Then there are the mid-level embalmers, the guys who actually know what they're doing, but are still important enough that they don't have to touch the really gross stuff. They supervise, make sure you're not completely botching someone's eternal afterlife, and occasionally step in when you look like you're about to pass out, which is often. And finally, there's you and your fellow apprentices. At the bottom of the food chain, you're the ones who get to experience the full sensory assault of human decomposition, while everyone else floats around in clouds of myrrh and superiority. The supply list reads like a shopping list written by a serial killer, with expensive taste. Natron salt, roughly £400 per body. Apparently the dead are saltier than a Twitter argument. Various resins and oils, frankincense, myrrh, cedar oil, and other substances that cost more than your annual salary. Linen strips, approximately 1,000 yards per mummy, because apparently the dead need more fabric than a Victorian dress. Canopic jars, 4 per customer, and God help you if you mix them up. Various tools that look like they were designed by someone with a questionable understanding of anatomy. Sawdust for stuffing body cavities, because nothing says eternal dignity like being packed with wood shavings. Amulets and charms, religious bling for the afterlife. Today's inventory reveals a problem. You're running low on linen. This is like being a gift wrapper the day before Christmas and discovering you're out of wrapping paper. Except instead of disappointed children, you have to face the wrath of grieving families who paid premium price for premium afterlife service. Your first customer of the day is Amenhotep III, not the pharaoh, just some wealthy merchant who happened to share the name, and apparently the ego. His family paid for the deluxe mummification package, which means 70 days of preservation, top-shelf resin, and enough religious ceremony to make the gods themselves dizzy. The body is, well, let's just say, Amenhotep III lived well. Too well. You're looking at roughly 200 pounds of deceased human, and every pound is going to have to be processed, preserved, and wrapped. It's like being asked to gift wrap a waterbed, except the waterbed is full of organs that need to be removed, catalogued, and stored in separate containers. The first major step in mummification is evisceration, removing all the organs that tend to rot quickly. This isn't like carving a turkey on Thanksgiving. This is precision surgery, performed with tools that look like they were borrowed from a torture chamber and sterilized with hope and prayer. You start with the brain, which has to be removed through the nose, using a long, hooked bronze rod. The process is exactly as delightful as it sounds. You have to basically turn the brain into soup, and then scoop it out through the nostrils, trying not to damage the face, because the family wants an open casket afterlife. The technique involves inserting the rod through the nostril, breaking through the thin bone at the base of the skull, then scrambling the brain tissue until it's liquid enough to pour out. It's like making the world's most horrific milkshake, and you're the unfortunate barista. Halfway through the brain removal, the smell hits you like a physical force. It's not just the smell of death, it's the smell of death mixed with the metallic scent of blood, the sour tang of brain tissue, and your own rising bile. You pause, take a deep breath, mistake, and immediately regret every life choice that led you to this moment. Steady, Kenty, calls out Seneb, one of the mid-level embalmers, from his safe distance across the room. Remember, You're facilitating Amenhotep's journey to the eternal realm. Easy for him to say. He's standing upwind and wearing enough perfume to mask the scent of a garbage fire. You manage to finish the brain removal without losing your breakfast, which counts as a victory in this line of work. The brain matter goes into a special basin where it will be mixed with sawdust and buried separately. Ancient Egyptians didn't think the brain was important. They figured all thinking happened in the heart. So, it gets the equivalent of a pauper's burial, while the rest of the body gets the 5-star treatment. Next comes the fun part, abdominal evisceration. You make an incision along the left side of the abdomen with an obsidian blade so sharp it could probably cut glass. The smell that emerges from the body cavity is like opening a refrigerator that's been unplugged for 3 weeks in the middle of summer. Your eyes water, your stomach lurches. You briefly consider career changes, farming, pottery, professional pyramid building, literally anything that doesn't involve being intimately acquainted with the contents of human torsos. But you press on because quitting means finding a new apprenticeship, and good luck explaining to potential employers why you left your last job. Here's where things get really interesting. Each organ has to be placed in a specific canopic jar, protected by a specific god, and if you mess this up, you're potentially condemning someone to an eternity of spiritual confusion. It's like a matching game designed by the gods themselves, with eternal consequences for wrong answers. The jars are Emseti, human-headed, for the liver, Hapi, baboon-headed, for the lungs, Duamutif, jackal-headed, for the stomach, Cuber Senuef, falcon-headed, for the intestine. Sounds simple enough, right? Wrong. Under pressure, with your eyes watering from the smell, and your hands shaking from trying not to vomit, these distinctions become surprisingly difficult to remember. Is the baboon for the lungs, or the stomach? Does the falcon get the intestines, or the liver? The consequences of mixing these up are theoretically eternal damnation, but more immediately, it's the wrath of the senior priests and the grieving family. You start with the liver, carefully extracting it from the body cavity. It's heavier than you expected, and has the consistency of firm jello that's been left out too long. You're pretty sure this goes in the human-headed jar, Imseti. But doubt creeps in. What if you're wrong? What if Amenhotep III spends eternity with his liver in the wrong spiritual container? The liver goes with Imseti. Seneb calls out, apparently reading your panicked expression. The human-headed jar, Kenti, and try to look more reverent. This is a sacred ritual, not a fish market. Easy for him to say. He's not the one with liver juice on his hands, trying to look spiritual while fighting back waves of nausea. You place the liver in Imseti's jar with what you hope passes for ceremonial dignity, then move on to the lung. The lungs are particularly challenging because they're spongy and tend to fall apart if you're not careful. It's like trying to remove wet bread from a sandwich without tearing it. You extract them piece by piece, trying to maintain their general lung-like shape while your stomach performs acrobatics that would impress a Cirque du Soleil performer. The lungs go to Hapi, baboon-headed, and you're reasonably confident about this one, because you remember making a mental note about Happy Baboon's breathing. It's the kind of mnemonic device that seems clever when you're studying, but sounds ridiculous when you're actually standing over a corpse with lung tissue in your hands. The stomach comes next, and this is where things get really challenging. The stomach is basically a bag of partially digested food that's been sitting in a dead body for 3 days. The smell alone could probably be weaponized. You extract it as quickly as possible, trying not to think about what Amenhotep III's last meal might have been, and place it in Duamutep's jackal-headed jar. Finally, the intestines. All 30 feet of them. This is like trying to untangle the world's most disgusting Christmas lights. while blindfolded and dizzy. The intestines need to be removed intact, if possible, cleaned and coiled neatly into Cabesnoef's falcon-headed jar. The process takes forever, and by the end, you're covered in various bodily fluids and questioning every decision you've ever made, with the organs safely stored in their respective jars. You're pretty sure you got them right, but you'll be having anxiety dreams about this for weeks. It's time for the preservation phase. This involves covering the entire body in natron salt for 40 days to remove all moisture and prevent decay. Natron is basically ancient Egyptian baking soda on steroids. It's incredibly effective at preservation, but working with it is like spending your day in a salt mine designed by someone with a sadistic sense of humor. The salt gets everywhere, in your eyes, up your nose, between your teeth. By the end of each day, you're basically a human pretzel. You begin by packing the body cavity with temporary stuffing, sawdust, rags, and natron salt. It's like stuffing a turkey, except the turkey used to be a person, and you're trying not to think about the existential implications of what you're doing. The body cavity needs to maintain its shape during the drying process, so the stuffing has to be packed just right. Not so loose that the body collapses, not so tight that it splits the skin. Then comes the full-body natron treatment. You have to completely bury Amenhotep III in salt, covering every inch of skin. It's back-breaking work, like building a sandcastle around a person. Except instead of sand, you're using caustic salt that burns your hands and makes your eyes water. The smell during this process is indescribable. It's the scent of salt mixing with bodily fluids, creating a bouquet that would make a skunk apologize. You wrap a cloth around your nose and mouth, but it only helps marginally. The smell seems to seep through fabric, through skin, directly into your soul. "Beautiful work, Kenti," comments Hemunu, the chief embalmer, as he glides past in his pristine white linen. Amenhotep III will enter the afterlife with dignity and grace. He's wearing what appears to be a small fortune in perfumed oils, creating a bubble of pleasant scent around him, like a walking air freshener. You nod respectfully, trying not to breathe through your nose, and continue your salt packing. This is only day one of the 40-day drying process. For the next 39 days, you'll need to check on the body, rotate it occasionally, and add more salt as needed. It's like caring for the world's most morbid garden. The next month and a bit becomes a routine of controlled horror. Every morning, you check on your various projects in different stages of preservation. Some bodies are just starting their natron treatment, others are halfway through, and a few are ready for the final wrapping stage. Each stage has its own unique challenges and aromatic experiences. Fresh bodies in the early stages have a sweet, sickly smell that clings to your clothes and follows you home. Bodies midway through the process develop a more complex bouquet, part salt, part leather, part something indefinable that makes your stomach flip. Bodies ready for wrapping have a dry, dusty scent that's almost pleasant by comparison, like old parchment mixed with spices. You develop coping mechanisms. You learn to breathe only through your mouth during the worst parts. You discover that eating strong flavored foods, onions, garlic, anything with bite, before work helps mask the taste of death that seems to coat your tongue. You start burning incense in your quarters, not for religious reasons, but because it's the only way to get any sleep without dreaming about the smell. Your social life completely disappears, such as it was. Even after bathing, and you bathe obsessively now, you carry the scent of your work like an invisible cloud. People can smell you coming from across the marketplace. Children point and whisper. Potential romantic interests take one whiff and suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. You become part of a strange fraternity of embalmers and apprentices, bonded by shared trauma and mutual understanding of what the job entails. Your conversations develop a dark humor that would horrify normal people. You compare notes on particularly challenging extractions, debate the best techniques for brain removal, and share tips for managing nausea. "Did you hear about Camorset's disaster yesterday?" asks Annie, another apprentice, during a brief break. "Mixed up the canopic jars for a priest's wife. Put the liver with the baboon instead of the human head. Ouch." You wince. "How do you explain that to the family?" "Told them it was a new technique for enhanced spiritual protection. They bought it, but Hemunu made him redo the whole thing properly." These are the kinds of work stories you tell now. Not, "I helped a customer find the perfect sandals," or "I learned a new bread recipe," but "I successfully removed 30 feet of intestines without breaking them, and I only vomited twice during a brain extraction." As the weeks pass, you begin to understand the method behind the madness. Mummification is actually incredibly sophisticated for its time. Its chemistry, anatomy, and preservation science. Wrapped up in religious ceremony, the ancient Egyptians figured out techniques for preserving human tissue that wouldn't be matched in other cultures for thousands of years. The natron salt works by drawing out all moisture from the body, creating an environment where bacteria can't survive. The resins and oils have antimicrobial properties that further prevent decay. The wrapping process creates an airtight seal that protects the preserved tissue from environmental damage. It's brilliant, really, when you can step back from the sensory assault long enough to appreciate the science. But you're rarely afforded that luxury. Most of your time is spent in the thick of the work, trying not to disgrace yourself or the profession, while handling tasks that would make a modern medical examiner queasy. The theoretical elegance of the preservation process doesn't make it any easier to deal with the practical reality of extracting organs from bodies that have been dead for several days. You start to develop a professional detachment that surprises you. Bodies become projects rather than people. You stop thinking about Amenhotep III as someone who had hopes, dreams, and a family who loved him, and start thinking of him as the fat merchant in room 2 who's going to need extra linen. It's a psychological defense mechanism, but it also makes you wonder what this job is doing to your soul. After 40 days in the salt, bodies are ready for the final phase, wrapping. This should theoretically be the easiest part. No more organ removal, no more natron burns, just carefully wrapping preserved bodies in linen. In practice, it's like trying to gift wrap a life-sized action figure that's been made of leather and filled with sawdust, while wearing mittens, blindfolded, during an earthquake. The first step is removing the temporary stuffing and replacing it with permanent materials. Sawdust, linen scraps, and various resins that will help the body maintain its shape for eternity. This involves reaching into body cavities that have been dried and treated, working in spaces that are cramped, awkward, and still manage to smell like death, despite 40 days of salt treatment. You stuff Amen, Utep III, with the care of someone packing a fragile vase for shipping, because essentially, that's what you're doing. Preparing a human body for a journey that will theoretically last forever. The stuffing has to be distributed evenly, packed firmly enough to maintain shape, but not so tightly that it distorts the body's natural proportion. Next comes the application of resins and oils to make the skin more pliable for wrapping. This involves coating the entire body in substances that cost more than most people make in a year. The resins are imported from far-off lands, traded for gold and precious stones, and here you are, slathering them on dead people like you're marinating a roast. The actual wrapping process starts with the extremities, fingers and toes first, then hands and feet, working your way up to larger body parts. Each finger gets individually wrapped with narrow linen strips, then the hand as a whole, then the forearm, then the upper arm. It's incredibly time-consuming and requires a level of attention to detail that would challenge a master craftsman. The linen has to be wrapped in specific patterns, with specific tensions, following traditions that have been passed down for generations. Too loose, and the wrapping will come undone over time. Too tight, and you risk tearing the preserved skin or distorting the body's shape. It's like being asked to perform microsurgery using techniques you learned from watching other people work. Amulets and charms get placed at specific points during the wrapping process. Protection for the journey to the afterlife, spiritual insurance policies against the various dangers that await the dead. Each amulet has to be positioned correctly and secured properly, because losing your spiritual protection in the underworld would be like arriving at a job interview without pants. The whole process takes days, and by the end, your hands are raw from handling rough linen, your back aches from bending over the wrapping table, and you've developed what you're pretty sure is a permanent squint from focusing on detailed work in poor lighting. When the wrapping is finally complete, Amenhotep III looks like a human-shaped package, wrapped by someone who learned their technique from watching spiders build webs. The wrapping is neat, secure, and follows all the traditional patterns. But you can't shake the feeling that you might have forgotten something important. This is when Hemunu arrives for the final inspection, gliding into the room like a swan made of expensive fabric and judgment. He examines your work with the critical eye of someone who's never had to actually touch a dead body, but has very strong opinions about how it should be done. The wrapping appears adequate, he pronounces, after a thorough examination, though perhaps next time you could achieve more uniform tension in the arm bindings. He says this while standing upwind and breathing through a perfumed cloth, making his critique feel somewhat hollow. But adequate is good enough. For your first major solo project, Amenhotep III will enter the afterlife, properly preserved, correctly wrapped, and with his organs in the right jars. Probably, his family will be satisfied, the gods will be appeased, and you won't be demoted back to cleaning tools and fetching supplies. The completion of a mummification always brings a strange mix of relief and emptiness. Relief, because you've survived another 70-day ordeal without completely disgracing yourself. Emptiness, because despite all the work and skill involved, you're essentially just making dead people look presentable for eternity. It's not exactly the kind of work that provides a sense of profound fulfillment. Your job affects every aspect of your life in ways you never anticipated. Dating becomes virtually impossible when your conversation topics include optimal brain removal techniques and the proper storage temperature for liver tissue. Your clothes carry a faint scent, no matter how often you wash them, that makes people unconsciously step away from you in crowds. Family gatherings become awkward when relatives ask about your work. How do you explain to your cousin, the farmer, that you spent your week elbow deep in some merchant's abdomen, carefully extracting organs that have been marinating in their own juices for 3 days? Most people's jobs involve creating something: bread, pottery, buildings, children. Your job involves preventing things from rotting, which is technically impressive, but doesn't make for great dinner conversation. You develop friendships exclusively within the funeral industry. Other embalmers, tomb builders, professional mourners, people who understand that death is a business and that someone has to handle the practical details of mortality. These relationships have a gallows humor that helps everyone cope with the daily reality of working with the dead. I had a nightmare last night, Annie tells you over beer, after a particularly challenging day. Dreamed I was being mummified, but the embalmer kept mixing up the canopic jars. Which organs ended up where, you ask? Because this is the kind of question that makes perfect sense in your social circle. My liver ended up with the baboon, my lungs went to the falcon, and somehow my brain ended up in the stomach jar. That's not even anatomically possible, you point out. That's what made it a nightmare. This passes for normal conversation now. You've joined a professional subculture that views the human body as a collection of parts to be processed and preserved, death as a business opportunity, and successful organ removal as a source of professional pride. The funeral business in ancient Egypt is surprisingly lucrative, but the money flows upward through a strict hierarchy that leaves apprentices like you living on the financial equivalent of table scraps. The deluxe mummification package that Amenhotep III's family purchased cost roughly the equivalent of a small house, but your cut is barely enough to keep you fed and housed. Wealthy families spare no expense for their departed loved ones. Premium resins, the finest linen, elaborate canopic jars, enough religious ceremony to make the gods themselves dizzy with incense. Middle-class families opt for the standard package, decent preservation, adequate wrapping, basic religious observances. Poor families get the economy treatment, quick and dirty preservation that will get their loved ones to the afterlife, but won't win any awards for presentation. You work on all three tiers, and the difference in treatment is stark. Wealthy clients get the full 70-day treatment in climate-controlled rooms with the finest materials and constant supervision. Poor clients get rushed through in 30 days with whatever materials are available and minimal supervision. The wealthy dead get individual attention and custom treatment. The poor dead get processed in batches, like mass-produced goods. The irony isn't lost on you that death, supposedly the great equalizer, actually highlights social inequality more starkly than life ever did. Rich people get to be immortal with dignity and style. Poor people get to be immortal on the cheap, with corners cut and standards relaxed. Your position in this economic hierarchy is precarious. You're skilled enough to handle complex procedures, but replaceable enough that a single major mistake could end your career. There are always other young men willing to trade their sense of smell and social life for steady employment in a recession-proof industry. After months of this work, you start noticing changes in yourself that go beyond just the lingering smell of death. Your hands have developed a permanent stain from handling natron salt and various resins. Your back aches constantly from bending over bodies and wrapping tables. Your eyes water chronically from exposure to caustic substances and pungent odors. You've developed what you privately call embalmer's lung, a persistent cough from inhaling dust, salt crystals, and various airborne particles that come with the job. Your sense of taste has become unreliable. Everything tastes vaguely of salt and preservatives. Your sleep is often disrupted by dreams featuring dismembered bodies and misplaced organs. The psychological effects are harder to quantify, but equally real. You've become desensitized to sights and smells that would horrify normal people, but hypersensitive to other things. The sound of tearing fabric makes you flinch because it reminds you of the sound skin makes when it's been over-dried. You can't eat certain foods because their texture reminds you of organs you've handled. Your relationship with your own mortality has become complicated. On one hand, you've seen death up close and personal so often that it's lost some of its terror. It's just another biological process that needs to be managed. On the other hand, you've become acutely aware of all the ways the human body can fail, decay, and betray the person inhabiting it. You find yourself unconsciously examining living people and wondering what their organs might look like, how difficult their mummification might be, whether their families could afford the deluxe treatment. It's a deeply disturbing train of thought that you try to suppress, but can't entirely eliminate. About 6 months into your apprenticeship, you have a day that perfectly encapsulates everything that can go wrong in this profession. It starts when you arrive at work to discover that rats have gotten into the supply room overnight and contaminated half your linen supplies. This is like a surgeon discovering that someone has used their sterile instruments to dig a garden. The contaminated linen has to be discarded, leaving you critically short of wrapping materials, with 3 bodies scheduled for final wrapping that day. Hemiunu is furious. The families are demanding their loved ones be completed on schedule, and you're trying to figure out how to make 500 yards of linen stretch to cover 1,500 yards worth of wrapping while you're dealing with the linen crisis. word comes that a new body has arrived. A priest who died unexpectedly and whose family wants the express treatment. They're willing to pay extra for rushing the job. But express mummification is like speed dating with death. All the same procedures, but with added pressure and increased chance of catastrophic failure. You start working on the priest while trying to manage the linen shortage crisis and supervise a new apprentice who's having his first day on the job. The new kid, Kenti Ka, is everything you were 6 months ago. Eager, naive, and completely unprepared for the sensory assault of professional death handling. The priest's evisceration goes smoothly until you get to the intestines, which have apparently been weakened by whatever killed him, and start falling apart in your hands. It's like trying to remove wet tissue paper from a gift box. The more carefully you try to handle it, the more likely it is to disintegrate. You end up having to extract the intestines in pieces, which technically preserves them, but makes for a very messy presentation in the canopic jar. Meanwhile, Kenti Ka takes one look at the brain removal process and promptly vomits all over the floor, which you now have to clean up while maintaining sterile conditions for the priest's preservation. The smell of fresh vomit, mixing with the existing aromatic atmosphere, creates a bouquet that would make a vulture gag. While you're cleaning up vomit and trying to salvage fragmented intestines, a messenger arrives with news that one of yesterday's clients has developed some kind of post-mortem leak. Apparently, the body cavity wasn't sealed properly and is now seeping fluids through the wrapping. The family is understandably upset and demanding immediate repairs. You have to stop working on the priest to examine the leaking mummy, which involves unwrapping part of yesterday's work to identify and fix the problem. It's like being a plumber, except instead of pipes, you're dealing with body cavities, and instead of water damage, you're trying to prevent spiritual contamination. The leak turns out to be caused by a small tear in the abdominal wall that you missed during the initial preservation. The kind of mistake that happens when you're working too fast or not paying close enough attention. You repair the tear, repack the cavity, and rewrap the affected area. But the whole process takes 3 hours and puts you behind schedule on everything else. By the time you get back to the priest, the body has been sitting exposed for too long and has started to dry unevenly. The skin has tightened in some places and become loose in others, making the final wrapping process much more difficult. It's like trying to gift wrap a piece of fruit that started to shrivel. The linen shortage forces you to be creative with your wrapping technique, using shorter strips and more complex patterns to make the available material stretch. The end result is functional, but looks distinctly non-standard, like a mummy wrapped by someone who learned the technique from a book rather than proper training. Himyunu's final inspection is predictably harsh. The priest's mummy is deemed acceptable under the circumstances, which is professional speak for, this is clearly substandard work, but we're not going to make you do it over. The leaking mummy repair passes inspection, but with warnings about the importance of thorough initial work. By the end of the day, you're exhausted, demoralized, and covered in various fluids that you'd rather not identify. Kenti Ka has quit and gone back to his family's farming operation, deciding that growing grain is preferable to processing human organs. You don't blame him. Despite the horror and monotony of the work, there are occasional moments that remind you why this job matters to people. Families don't pay enormous sums and trust their loved ones to your care just because they have money to burn. They genuinely believe that proper mummification is essential for their relatives' eternal happiness. You witness grief that's raw and real, love that transcends death, and hope that maybe, somehow, consciousness continues beyond biological failure. A widow brings you her husband's favorite amulet and asks you to make sure it's placed over his heart. A father insists on watching the entire process for his young son, wanting to ensure that every step is performed correctly. A grown man breaks down crying when he sees his mother's completed mummy, overwhelmed by the reality that she's really gone. These moments make the work feel less like a gory trade and more like a sacred service. You're not just preventing decay, you're helping people cope with loss, providing comfort through ritual and serving as a bridge between the world of the living and whatever comes after. But these meaningful moments are balanced by the purely commercial aspects of the business. Families arguing over upgrade costs, haggling over the quality of materials, threatening to take their business elsewhere if they don't get what they consider adequate service. Death may be sacred, but the death business is still a business, complete with competitive pricing, customer complaints, and the occasional refund demand. Every apprentice has their collection of spectacular failures, the learning experiences that teach you exactly why certain procedures exist and what happens when you ignore them. Your personal greatest hits include: you managed to put all 4 organs in the wrong jars for a wealthy merchant's wife. The liver went to the baboon, the lungs went to the falcon, the stomach went to the human, and the intestines went to the jackal. It was like playing the world's most consequential shell game while blindfolded. The mistake wasn't discovered until the final blessing ceremony, when the priest noticed that the jar arrangements didn't match the traditional patterns. You had to re-extract all the organs from their wrong jars, clean them, re-preserve them, and place them correctly, all while the family watched in horror and the senior priests muttered about modern apprentices and declining standards. You packed a body cavity too tightly with sawdust and natron, causing the preserved skin to split during the drying process. The body essentially exploded like an overstuffed sausage, requiring extensive reconstruction work and creative wrapping to hide the damage. The family never knew, but you spent 2 weeks having nightmares about exploding corpses. You mixed the wrong proportions of resins for a preservation treatment, creating a substance that never properly hardened. The body remained sticky and tacky throughout the entire process, making wrapping nearly impossible. The linen strips would stick to the body in all the wrong places, creating a finished product that looked like it had been wrapped by a spider having a seizure. Each mistake taught you something valuable, but the learning process was like getting an education from a very patient but occasionally explosive teacher. The consequences of error weren't just professional embarrassment, they potentially affected someone's eternal afterlife, which added a level of pressure that made every procedure feel like performing surgery while walking a tightrope. The mummification business has seasonal fluctuations that affect both the volume of work and the types of challenges you face. Summer brings more deaths from heat-related illnesses, but also accelerated decomposition that makes timing critical. Winter deaths are easier to preserve, but harder to dry properly in the humid conditions. Flood season is particularly challenging because the high humidity interferes with the natron treatment, extending the drying time and sometimes requiring multiple salt treatments to achieve proper preservation. Bodies that would normally be ready for wrapping in 40 might need 60 or 70 days to dry completely. Religious festivals create their own scheduling pressures. Families want their loved ones' mummification completed in time for major ceremonies, creating artificial deadlines that force you to rush procedures that shouldn't be rushed. The Festival of the Dead brings a surge of new clients as families decide to upgrade their ancestors' preservation treatments or commission new protective charms. War years are the worst. Battlefield casualties arrive in large numbers, often in poor condition from wounds and exposure. Mass casualty processing requires techniques that prioritize efficiency over individual attention. You develop assembly line methods for handling multiple bodies simultaneously, using shared natron pools and standardized wrapping patterns. The economic impact of these seasonal variations means that your income fluctuates wildly throughout the year. Busy periods bring overtime work and bonus payments, but slow periods mean reduced hours and delayed wages. You learn to save money during profitable seasons to survive the lean months. The mummification industry isn't a monopoly. There are other embalmers, other houses of purification, other professionals competing for the same grieving families and their money. This competition drives innovation, but also creates pressure to cut corners and reduce costs. Cheaper operations offer budget mummification that skips steps, uses inferior materials, or employs less experienced workers. They can undercut your prices significantly, but the quality difference is usually obvious to anyone who knows what to look for. The question is whether grieving families can tell the difference, or whether they care enough to pay extra for superior service. Some competitors specialize in specific types of preservation: military mummification for warriors, accelerated processing for families in a hurry, or luxury treatments for the extremely wealthy. Specialization allows them to charge premium prices for their expertise, but limits their potential customer base. You've heard rumors of black market embalmers who operate without proper licensing or religious oversight, offering cut-rate services with no guarantee of spiritual efficacy. These operations allegedly use recycled materials, skip important religious ceremonies, and employ workers with no formal training. The thought of your loved ones being processed by such people is horrifying, but their low prices attract families who can't afford legitimate services. The competitive pressure forces constant improvement in your own skills and techniques. You can't afford to be complacent when other embalmers are developing new preservation methods, offering additional services, or finding ways to reduce processing time without sacrificing quality. The tools of mummification haven't changed significantly in centuries, which means you're performing complex procedures with equipment that would look primitive to modern eyes, but was state-of-the-art for its time. Your toolkit includes bronze knives, sharp enough to make precise incisions, but requiring constant maintenance to keep their edges. A dull blade makes clean cuts impossible and increases the risk of tearing skin or organs. Obsidian blades, sharper than bronze, but more fragile. Used for the most delicate work, these volcanic glass blades can achieve incredibly fine edges, but they chip easily and need frequent replacement. Bronze hooks and probes for brain removal and internal manipulation. These tools require incredible precision. Too much pressure and you damage the skull or face. Too little and you can't effectively remove brain tissue. Natrum salt, your primary preservation medium. Mined from desert deposits and processed to remove impurities. Quality varies significantly between sources, affecting both preservation effectiveness and working conditions. Linen strips, hand-woven to specific widths and lengths, with quality ranging from coarse utility wrapping to fine ceremonial binding. The texture, weave, and tensile strength all affect the final appearance and durability of the wrapping. Various containers for storing organs, mixing preservatives, and holding tools. These range from simple clay pots to elaborate canopic jars carved from stone and decorated with precious metals. Working with these tools requires skills that combine surgery, chemistry, and craftsmanship. You have to understand anatomy well enough to locate and remove organs without damaging surrounding tissue, chemistry well enough to mix preservatives with the right properties, and craftsmanship well enough to produce finished mummies that will last for millennia. The physical demands of using these tools, day after day, take their toll. Your hands develop calluses in specific patterns from gripping bronze implements. Your shoulders and back ache from the postures required for detailed work. Your eyes strain from working in poor lighting conditions with tools that require precise control. Not all bodies are created equal when it comes to mummification. Age, health, cause of death, and time elapsed since death all affect the preservation process in ways that require different approaches and techniques. Young, healthy bodies are the easiest to work with. Organs are well defined. skin is resilient, and decomposition proceeds predictably. These are the cases you hope for when you're learning new techniques or training junior apprentices. Elderly bodies present unique challenges. Skin becomes fragile and tears easily. Organs may be diseased or abnormally shaped, and bone density changes can affect procedures like brain removal. The preservation process often takes longer because aged tissue absorbs and releases moisture differently. Bodies of people who died from diseases can be particularly difficult. Certain illnesses affect tissue composition, making preservation unpredictable. Infectious diseases require special handling procedures to protect workers, adding complexity and risk to an already challenging process. Trauma victims present the most complex challenges. Bodies damaged by accidents, violence, or warfare may require extensive reconstruction before preservation can begin. Missing limbs need to be replaced with artificial components. Damaged organs must be repaired or substituted, and torn skin requires careful stitching. Decomposed bodies that arrive days or weeks after death push your skills to their limits. Advanced decomposition can make organ identification difficult, skin fragile to the point of dissolution, and preservation uncertain. These cases often require experimental techniques and creative problem-solving. Each type of body teaches you something different about anatomy, preservation chemistry, and the limits of your craft. The variety keeps the work intellectually challenging, but also means that no amount of experience can completely prepare you for every situation you'll encounter. The mummification industry operates within complex religious and social hierarchies that affect every aspect of your work. Religious authorities dictate proper procedures, government officials regulate the industry, and social customs determine acceptable practices for different classes of people. Religious politics are particularly complex because different priests may have different opinions about proper procedures, and contradicting a priest can have serious consequences for your career. Some priests are sticklers for traditional methods, others are open to innovation, and a few are primarily concerned with maximizing their own profits from the religious aspects of the process. Social hierarchies affect everything from the materials you're allowed to use to the level of care you're expected to provide. Mummifying a noble requires different procedures, better materials, and more ceremonial attention than preserving a merchant. The differences aren't just about money, they reflect deeply held beliefs about social order and spiritual worthiness. Government regulation covers everything from licensing requirements to material standards to waste disposal. Inspectors periodically review your work, and failing an inspection can mean losing your license, paying fines, or facing criminal charges. The regulations are supposedly designed to maintain industry standards, but they also create bureaucratic obstacles that can interfere with actual work. Guild politics within the embalming profession determine who gets access to training, who can work on prestigious clients, and who gets promoted to supervisory positions. Like any professional organization, the Embalming Guild has its internal conflicts, power struggles, and favoritism that affect individual careers. Navigating these various political pressures requires skills that weren't covered in your apprenticeship training. You have to learn to read social cues, understand unstated expectations, and manage relationships with people who have power over your career, but may not understand the technical aspects of your work. Extended exposure to death and decay affects your mental state in ways that are difficult to describe to people who haven't experienced it. You develop a strange relationship with mortality that colors your perception of everything else in life. Desensitization happens gradually. Things that would have horrified you initially become routine workplace experiences. You stop noticing smells that would make normal people vomit. You handle human organs with the same casual familiarity that a baker handles dough. This adaptation is necessary for doing the job, but it also creates a psychological distance from normal human experiences. Hypervigilance about your own health becomes a constant background concern. When you spend your days examining diseased organs and decomposing tissue, you become acutely aware of every ache, pain, and irregularity in your own body. A minor cough becomes a potential sign of serious illness. A small cut becomes a possible source of infection. Existential questions about life, death, and meaning become unavoidable when you're literally handling the physical remnants of human existence. What makes a person more than just a collection of organs? Where does consciousness go when the body dies? How can something as complex as human personality simply cease to exist? Social isolation results from both the practical aspects of your work, the smell, the associations, and the psychological distance that develops between you and people who haven't confronted mortality in such direct ways. Normal social conversations about daily concerns can seem trivial when you've spent your day preparing someone for eternity. Dark humor becomes a coping mechanism that helps process the absurdities and horrors of the work. Jokes that would appall normal people become essential stress relief among your colleagues. This humor serves as psychological protection, but it also marks you as different from mainstream society. The psychological effects of the work are cumulative. They build up over months and years, creating changes in personality and worldview that may not be immediately obvious, but are profound and lasting. 2 years into your apprenticeship, you have reached a crossroads. The technical skills that once seemed impossible have become second nature. You can remove a brain through the nose without breaking the skull, extract 30 feet of intestines without tearing them, and wrap a body with precision that would impress a master craftsman. But the cost of acquiring these skills has been higher than you ever imagined. Your health is compromised, your social life is non-existent, and your relationship with your own mortality has become deeply complex. You've learned to find meaning in work that most people would consider horrifying, but you've also sacrificed parts of yourself that you can never recover. Standing in the house of purification at the end of another day, surrounded by the tools of your trade and the lingering aroma of preservation chemicals, you reflect on the strange path that brought you here. You never planned to become a professional death handler, but life has a way of leading people into careers they never imagined. The job is everything you feared it would be when you started. Messy, smelly, socially isolating, and psychologically challenging, but it's also provided you with skills, knowledge, and experiences that have shaped your understanding of life, death, and human nature in ways that no other profession could have offered. You've learned to find humor in the absurd, meaning in the mundane, and satisfaction in work that most people would consider horrifying. You've developed professional competence in a field that requires technical skill, physical endurance, and psychological resilience. You've earned the respect of colleagues and the gratitude of families who trusted you with their most precious possessions. The smell of death and preservation chemicals has become so much a part of your life that you barely notice it anymore. It's woven into your clothes, your hair, your skin, and probably your soul. It's the professional perfume of someone who works at the intersection of life and death, helping families navigate the transition from one state to the other. Could you survive being a mummy wrapper with a weak stomach in ancient Egypt? The answer, surprisingly, is yes. Not because the work becomes easier or because your stomach becomes stronger, but because you discover that human adaptability is more powerful than physical limitations. The mind finds ways to cope with experiences that the body rejects, and purpose can overcome even the most challenging circumstances. Your weak stomach never disappeared, but it became irrelevant. Because when you're helping someone achieve eternal life, when you're serving as a bridge between this world and the next, when you're part of something larger than yourself, physical discomfort becomes just another occupational hazard to be managed and overcome. After all, in a world where everyone dies eventually, Job security in the death industry is about as guaranteed as anything gets. And sometimes, finding your calling means discovering that you're stronger than you ever thought possible, even when that strength comes with a very particular and permanent professional aroma. Hey there! Tonight we're diving deep into ancient Egypt. Not the Egypt of textbooks or Hollywood movies, but the real Egypt, where curiosity could literally kill the cat. And sometimes, the prince who owned it. Drop a comment, let me know where you're listening from, and buckle up, because this story involves tomb robbing, ancient curses, and a prince who probably should have chosen a safer hobby. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's travel back to when magic was real and some doors were meant to stay closed. You are Prince Kamwaset, fourth son of the mighty Ramesses II, which means you're royal enough to live in luxury, but not royal enough to inherit the throne. Your older brothers are off, conquering territories and commanding armies, while you've chosen a different path. You're basically ancient Egypt's first archaeologist, which sounds way cooler than it actually is. While your brothers collect battle scars, you collect ancient artifacts. While they study military tactics, you study hieroglyphs that make your eyes cross. While they're building their reputations on the battlefield, you're building yours in dusty tombs and forgotten ruins. Your family thinks you're eccentric, your friends think you're obsessed, and honestly, they're both right. The year is 1250 BCE, and you've just discovered something that's going to change everything. Hidden in the Valley of the Kings, behind a rockfall that's been undisturbed for over 2 centuries, you found the sealed entrance to a tomb that shouldn't exist. The tomb of Ankh-in Sekhmet, high priest of the goddess Sekhmet, and according to legend, master of magic, so powerful it had to be buried with him. Most scholars dismiss such claims as typical funerary propaganda. You know, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of LinkedIn endorsements. Everyone's a dynamic leader and innovative problem solver, even after they're dead. But you found references to this priest in multiple sources, all hinting at genuine supernatural abilities and warning against disturbing his eternal rest. The entrance seal is covered with hieroglyphs that translate to something like, "Sacred to Sekhmet, guardian of the hidden fire. Let no man enter who values his life above wisdom, for the priest sleeps with powers that should not wake." Below this cheerful message is carved a golden scarab, wings spread wide, clutching Ankh symbols in its claws. Your team consists of your most trusted servants, Sineb, your scribe and translator, Hori, your excavation foreman, and a dozen workmen who've served your family for years. They've worked in absolute secrecy, because you know that word of an intact tomb would attract unwanted attention from both official authorities and unofficial tomb robbers. As you prepare to break the seal, even your rational mind starts to question this decision. The hieroglyphs aren't just warnings, they're detailed descriptions of what happens to people who disturb this particular grave. And let's just say, the ancient Egyptians had very creative imaginations about eternal punishment. But curiosity wins, as it always does. The seal breaks with a sound like thunder echoing through stone. Immediately, a rush of air escapes from the tomb, air that's been trapped for 200 years, carrying with it the scent of incense, myrrh, and something else, something that makes your skin crawl, like death mixed with electricity. The entrance corridor descends steeply, its walls covered with hieroglyphs and paintings that depict scenes you've never encountered before. These aren't the standard funerary texts showing the journey through the underworld. These show priests performing rituals with strange artifacts, summoning creatures that look like no earthly animals, and manipulating forces that bend reality itself. The artwork is extraordinarily detailed and remarkably well preserved. The colors remain vibrant. After 2 centuries, the gold leaf still gleams in your torchlight, and the hieroglyphs are carved with a precision that suggests They were meant to be functional rather than merely decorative. Your scribe Seneb stops to examine the texts more closely. His face goes pale as he realizes these aren't standard religious formulas. They appear to be actual magical procedures with precise instructions for their performance. Step-by-step guides for manipulating life and death, written with the precision of a medical manual. The corridor opens into a large antechamber filled with grave goods that surpass anything you've seen in other tombs. Golden furniture, jeweled weapons, ceremonial clothing, and dozens of canopic jars suggest enormous wealth. But it's the unusual items that catch your attention. Objects that don't fit into standard categories of Egyptian artifacts. There are crystalline orbs that seem to generate their own light. Metal devices covered with hieroglyphs that move and shift as you watch. Containers filled with substances that glow with colors that shouldn't exist. In the center of the chamber stands a golden statue of Sekhmet, but this statue is different from traditional representations. It seems almost alive, its eyes following your movement, its mouth curved in what might be a smile or a snarl. But the most striking feature of the chamber is the golden scarab that hangs suspended in the air above the statue, rotating slowly, without any visible means of support. It's identical to the scarab carved on the entrance seal, but this one is three-dimensional, crafted from solid gold and encrusted with gems that catch and reflect your torchlight in impossible ways. Hori asks the obvious question: how is it floating? You approach the scarab cautiously, studying it from every angle. There are no wires, no hidden supports, no explanation for how a solid gold object can hang motionless in the air. As you draw closer, you can see that the scarab is covered with tiny hieroglyphs, inscribed so small they're barely visible, forming spiral patterns that seem to move and shift in the dancing light. Your rational mind suggests it's some kind of magnetic force the ancient Egyptians understood, natural forces that you've forgotten. But as you reach toward the scarab, it suddenly begins to glow with warm golden light, and the hieroglyphs on its surface start to pulse in rhythm with your heartbeat. The workmen step back in alarm, but you're transfixed by the artifact's beauty and mystery. The rational part of your mind knows this is beyond anything that ancient Egyptian technology should have been capable of producing, but your curiosity overwhelms your caution. You reach out and grasp the golden scarab. The moment your fingers touch the artifact, the world explodes into light and sensation. Images flood your mind, visions of ancient Egypt as it's never been recorded in any history. Scenes of priests wielding powers that defy natural law, civilizations that rose and fell before the pyramids were built. You see Ankhefen Sekhmet as he lived, a tall man with piercing eyes, who commanded forces that modern priests could barely imagine. But with the visions comes something else, a presence, ancient and powerful, that's been sleeping in the scarab for 2 centuries. You feel it stirring, awakening, turning its attention toward you with an intensity that makes your knees buckle. The voice speaks directly into your mind, not through your ears. Ancient, authoritative, and deeply amused. Who dares disturb the rest of one who mastered the hidden arts, who seeks knowledge that was buried for the safety of the world? You try to drop the scarab, but your hand won't obey. The artifact has fused to your palm, becoming part of your flesh, and with it comes knowledge, terrible, wonderful knowledge of powers that have been deliberately forgotten. When the visions finally end, you find yourself on your knees in the antechamber, the golden scarab now embedded in your right palm, like a living tattoo. Your men cluster around you, their faces filled with concern and fear, but you barely notice them. Your mind is reeling from the knowledge that's been forced into it. Secrets of ancient magic that no living person is supposed to possess. Through the scarab, You've connected with the spirit of Ankhefen Sekhmet, and the dead priest has shared memories spanning decades of research into forces that exist beyond the normal world. What most people call magic is actually science, the manipulation of natural forces through precise understanding and careful technique. But this science is dangerous, capable of destroying entire civilizations if misused, which is why it was deliberately hidden and forgotten. The priest learned this truth, too late to prevent his own downfall. Through the scarab's memories, you see what happened to the high priest. He started with noble intentions, using his knowledge to heal the sick and protect Egypt from its enemies, but the power gradually consumed him, making him believe he knew better than the gods themselves how the world should be ordered. He began experimenting on living subjects, creating hybrid creatures that served his will, extending his own life far beyond its natural span, and manipulating the minds of others to ensure their loyalty. By the time he realized what he had become, it was too late. He had transformed from a healer into a monster, and only his own death could prevent further corruption. As you absorb the priest's knowledge and warnings, strange things begin happening in the tomb. The golden statue of Sekhmet starts to glow with the same warm light as the scarab. Preserved biological materials in surrounding containers begin to show signs of life. Tissues that have been dead for 2 centuries start to pulse with renewed vitality. Your workmen notice the changes first, pointing nervously at containers where organs are beginning to move. Blood is starting to flow, and what appear to be embryonic creatures are beginning to develop. The very air in the chamber seems to thicken, becoming charged with energy that makes your skin tingle and your hair stand on end. Hori suggests you should leave this place. Something is waking up that should stay asleep, but you're too fascinated by the unfolding display to heed the warnings. Through the scarab, you can sense Ankhefen Sekhmet's consciousness stirring, awakening after 2 centuries of dormancy. The priest's spirit has been bound to his preserved remains, waiting for someone with sufficient knowledge and power to serve as a host for his return to the world of the living. The ancient voice whispers in your mind again, "You have the potential to surpass even my achievements. Together, we could restore Egypt to greatness, eliminate suffering, and create paradise on earth. But first, you must fully accept my knowledge and allow me to guide your actions." The temptation is overwhelming. You can feel the vast scope of the priest's accumulated wisdom, powers that could solve every problem that plagues Egypt: disease, famine, war, injustice. With such abilities, you could transform not just your kingdom, but the entire world, creating a golden age that would last forever. But you also remember the priest's own warnings about corruption and the price of power. Looking around the burial chamber, seeing the evidence of Ankhefen Sekhmet's experiments with life and death, you begin to understand what that price had been. The priest's golden sarcophagus suddenly cracks open with a sound like breaking crystal, revealing mummified remains that aren't normal mummy wrappings. The body is encased in what appears to be liquid gold that flows and moves like living tissue. As you watch in fascination and horror, the golden covering begins to dissolve, revealing flesh that looks as fresh as if death had occurred moments ago, rather than centuries. Ankhefen Sekhmet's eyes open, and they glow with the same golden light as the scarab. The priest sits up slowly, his movements fluid and graceful, despite his ancient age, and turns his gaze toward you. At last, someone worthy of inheriting my legacy. Come, my young prince, and learn what it truly means to wield power over life and death. What follows is the most intense education of your life. Over the course of several hours, Ankhefen Sekhmet shares not just knowledge, but actual memories, first-hand experiences of using ancient magic to accomplish miracles that later generations would dismiss as myths. He shows you how to accelerate plant growth, to end famine, how to purify water sources, to prevent disease, how to manipulate weather patterns, to ensure perfect harvests. He demonstrates techniques for healing injuries that should have been fatal, for extending human life beyond its normal span, and for creating artificial creatures that could serve humanity's needs. But he also reveals the darker applications of such power. Methods for controlling minds, for inflicting untraceable death, for creating plagues that could devastate entire populations. The same knowledge that could heal could also harm, and the line between beneficent use and malevolent abuse was often thinner than a reed's edge. The priest's lessons are intoxicating, but you begin to notice disturbing changes in yourself. The knowledge flowing through the scarab is changing you, making you see ordinary people as inferior beings who need guidance and control. You find yourself thinking of your servants not as loyal friends, but as useful tools, and of your subjects not as people to serve, but as resources to manage. Meanwhile, the effects of the awakened magic are spreading beyond the tomb. Strange reports begin reaching you from the outside world. Animals behaving oddly, plants growing in impossible configurations, people experiencing prophetic dreams and supernatural visions. The very fabric of reality seems to be shifting in response to the ancient powers that are stirring in the Valley of the Kings. Sineb, who has remained loyal throughout your exploration, finally confronts you about the changes he's observing. You are not the same man who entered this tomb. The knowledge you've gained is changing you, and not for the better. You look at your faithful scribe, and for a moment see him clearly, not as an inferior being to be managed, but as a friend who's genuinely concerned for your welfare. The realization shocks you back to awareness of what you're becoming. You're right, you admit. The power is corrupting me, just as it corrupted Ankef and Sekhmet. But how do you give up knowledge once gained? How do you unknow what you now know? The priest, who has been listening to your conversation, laughs coldly. You cannot unknow truth, young prince. You can only choose whether to embrace it or be destroyed by your own weakness. Power exists to be used, and knowledge exists to be applied. Anything else is mere cowardice. But you've seen enough of the priest's truth to recognize it as a beautiful lie. True wisdom wasn't about accumulating power, but about understanding when not to use it. The greatest strength wasn't in commanding others, but in controlling oneself. The climax comes when Ankithen Sekhmet reveals his ultimate plan. The priest hasn't awakened simply to share his knowledge. He intends to use your body as a permanent host, transferring his consciousness into your flesh while discarding his own ancient form. In doing so, he would gain not just renewed physical vitality, but also access to the royal bloodline and all the political power that comes with it. Together, we will rule Egypt as pharaoh and high priest. My knowledge combined with your royal blood will create a dynasty that will last for millennia. We will transform this kingdom into a paradise that will be the envy of all nations. But you now understand that the priest's vision of paradise would be a nightmare for everyone else. A world ruled by unlimited magical power would inevitably become a world of slavery where ordinary humans existed only to serve their supernatural masters. The transfer process has already begun. You can feel Ankef and Sekhmet's consciousness pressing into your mind, seeking to overwhelm and replace your own identity. The priest's memories and personality are incredibly strong, backed by centuries of accumulated power and experience. Resisting feels like trying to hold back the Nile flood with your bare hand. But you have one advantage that the priest hadn't anticipated. The support of your loyal friends, Sineb and the others, recognizing what's happening, begin performing their own rituals, not magical procedures, but simple human prayers to the gods they've served all their lives. Their faith, while lacking the sophistication of ancient magical knowledge, carries a purity and strength that the priest's corrupted power can't easily overcome. The battle between you plays out on multiple levels: physical, mental, and spiritual. In the burial chamber, your bodies appear to be locked in a strange dance, moving through positions that correspond to invisible forces flowing between you. In the realm of consciousness, your minds engage in a struggle for dominance that feels like intellectual combat, and in the spiritual dimension, your souls grapple for the right to inhabit the same physical form. The scarab in your palm becomes the focal point of your conflict, alternately glowing with golden light as the priest gains ground and dimming when you manage to reassert control. The artifact is both the source of the priest's power and the channel through which he seeks to complete his possession of your body. As the struggle intensifies, the tomb itself begins to react. The walls start to crack, releasing energy that's been contained for centuries. The preserved biological materials begin to decay rapidly, centuries of suspended animation catching up with them in moments. The golden sarcophagus begins to collapse, its liquid metal surface losing cohesion and flowing across the chamber floor. In the end, you realize that victory will require sacrifice. The scarab has become so integrated with your body and mind that removing it will likely kill you, but leaving it in place will eventually allow Ankefin Sekhmet to complete his possession. There's no middle ground. Either the priest will win completely, or both of you will be destroyed. The decision, when it comes, is surprisingly easy. You think of all the people who would suffer under the priest's rule, all the lives that would be destroyed or enslaved to serve his vision of paradise. The choice between your own life and the freedom of your people is no choice at all. Using the last of your strength, you grasp the scarab with both hands and begin to pull it from your palm. The pain is indescribable, like tearing away part of your soul, but you persist, drawing on reserves of determination you hadn't known you possessed. Ankefin Sekhmet's screams echo through the burial chamber as his anchor to the physical world is severed. You fool, you're destroying knowledge that could benefit all humanity. You're choosing ignorance over enlightenment. I'm choosing humility over hubris, you reply through gritted teeth, and freedom over slavery, even if that slavery is comfortable. The scarab finally comes free, taking with it not just the priest's power, but much of your life force. As the artifact separates from your flesh, you feel your strength ebbing, your vision growing dark, your connection to the world becoming tenuous. But your sacrifice accomplishes its purpose. Without the scarab to anchor him to the physical world, Ankefin Sekhmet's consciousness begins to fade, his carefully preserved form crumbling to dust. After centuries of unnatural existence, the priest's final words are a curse upon all who would choose ignorance over knowledge, weakness over strength. The tomb begins to collapse as the magical forces that had maintained it for so long are finally released. Ancient stones, no longer held in place by supernatural power, start falling from the ceiling. The elaborate decorations begin to fade, their colors bleeding away like watercolors in rain. Sineb and the others manage to carry your unconscious form to safety, just as the burial chamber seals itself forever. The entrance collapses in a shower of limestone and sand. When rescue parties arrive, days later, they find no trace of the tomb's location. The desert has reclaimed it, hiding its secrets beneath shifting dunes. You survive your ordeal, though you're forever changed by the experience. The removal of the scarab has cost you much of your physical strength and shortened your natural lifespan, but it has also freed you from the priest's corrupting influence. You spend your remaining years not in pursuit of power, but in service to your people, using your conventional knowledge of history and archaeology to preserve Egypt's cultural heritage. You never speak publicly about what happened in the tomb, but you do record your experiences in a sealed papyrus that you entrust to the temple archives, with instructions that it should only be opened if similar magical artifacts are discovered in the future. The document serves as both a warning about the dangers of ancient power and a guide for those who might face similar temptations. The golden scarab itself is never found. Some believe it was destroyed along with the tomb. Others suggest that it somehow survived and is waiting for another host to claim its power. You believe the artifact still exists, somewhere, dormant but not destroyed, and that someday another seeker of knowledge will face the same choice between wisdom and power that nearly destroyed you. In the years following the tomb's discovery and disappearance, similar artifacts begin turning up throughout Egypt. Magical objects left behind by ancient practitioners who delve too deeply into forces beyond human understanding. Each discovery brings the same temptations and dangers that you faced, and each requires individuals to choose between personal power and the common good. Your experience establishes a precedent for dealing with such discoveries, rather than seeking to exploit ancient magic for personal gain. Scholars and archaeologists begin to approach such artifacts with appropriate caution and respect. A secret organization is formed to identify and contain dangerous magical artifacts, preventing them from falling into the wrong hands, while preserving the knowledge they contain for future generations who might be better equipped to handle such power responsibly. You live to be 53, far shorter than the centuries of life that the scarab could have provided. But you die peacefully, surrounded by friends and family, secure in the knowledge that you chose correctly when faced with the ultimate test of character. Your tomb, when it's eventually built, contains no magical artifacts and no supernatural protections, just the simple grave goods appropriate to a royal prince and scholar. But it does contain one unusual feature: a golden scarab carved into the entrance seal, its wings spread wide, serving not as a source of power, but as a warning to future generations about the price of forbidden knowledge. Hey there! Tonight we're diving into one of ancient Egypt's most incredible stories, not about pyramids, or mummies, or treasure hunters, but about deception on a scale that would make modern politicians weep with envy. This is the story of Hatshepsut, Egypt's most successful pharaoh, who ruled the most powerful empire on earth for 22 years. While hiding a secret that could have destroyed everything she'd worked to build. Drop a comment, let me know what you think about leaders who have to choose between truth and effectiveness. And settle in, because this story involves royal intrigue, international blackmail, and a decision that changed the course of history. You are Hatshepsut, and you are living the most elaborate lie in human history. For over 2 decades, you've ruled Egypt as pharaoh, presenting yourself to the world as a man, wearing the false beard of kingship, commanding the loyalty of the most powerful empire on earth. But the time has come to face a truth that only your closest advisors know. You are a woman. The deception began not from ambition, but from necessity. When your husband, Thutmose II, died unexpectedly, Egypt faced a succession crisis that could have plunged the kingdom into chaos. The only heir was a young boy, son of a minor wife, with barely any royal blood in his veins. You, as the principal queen and daughter of Thutmose I, had more legitimate claim to the throne than anyone alive. But Egyptian law was clear: only men could rule as pharaoh. So you faced an impossible choice: watch Egypt tear itself apart in a succession struggle, or find a way to provide the strong leadership the kingdom desperately needed. The solution, when it came to you, was both brilliant and terrifying in its audacity. If Egypt needed a strong pharaoh, and if only men could serve as pharaoh, then you would become a man, at least in the eyes of the public, with the help of a small circle of trusted advisors. You began the most elaborate deception in Egyptian history. Everything about your public persona had to be carefully crafted to maintain the illusion. Your voice was trained to sound deeper and more authoritative. Your movements were studied and practiced to appear more masculine. Your clothes were designed to conceal your feminine figure while projecting the powerful image expected of a pharaoh. More challenging still was the need to rewrite your own history. Official records were altered to suggest you had always been male, the son rather than daughter of Thutmose I. Statues and reliefs were commissioned, showing you with the traditional masculine physique of pharaonic art. Even your name was modified, emphasizing syllables that sounded more masculine while de-emphasizing feminine elements. The deception worked better than anyone had dared hope. Egypt entered a golden age of prosperity and peace under your rule. Trade flourished, monumental building projects enhanced the kingdom's glory, and the military remained strong enough to deter aggression without needing to engage in costly campaigns. For over 2 decades, you ruled as one of Egypt's most successful pharaohs, and the secret of your true gender remained hidden from all but your most intimate advisors. But secrets have a way of fighting to be revealed. By the 20th year of your reign, maintaining the deception had become increasingly difficult. Age was changing your body in ways that were harder to conceal. Trusted advisors were dying and being replaced by younger officials who might not be as loyal, and Thutmose III, now a grown man, was beginning to assert his own claim to the throne that was rightfully his by birth. The crisis that would ultimately force you to reveal your secret began with the arrival of a Mesopotamian delegation seeking to negotiate a trade agreement with Egypt. Among the ambassadors was a man named Khasatid-in-Lil, ostensibly a merchant, but actually a spy for the Hittite Empire, which had been seeking ways to destabilize Egyptian power for decades. Khasatid-in-Lil was no ordinary spy. He was a master of observation, trained to notice details that others might miss. During his weeks at the Egyptian court, he began to suspect that something was not quite right about the pharaoh. Your voice, despite years of training, occasionally slipped into higher registers. Your movements, though carefully practiced, sometimes displayed a grace that seemed more feminine than masculine. Most tellingly, you never appeared in public without the elaborate royal regalia that could easily conceal physical characteristics. The Hittite spy began a careful investigation, bribing servants, questioning palace officials, and gradually piecing together evidence that Egypt's pharaoh was not what she appeared to be. When he had gathered enough proof to be certain of his conclusion, he faced a crucial decision: how to use this information most effectively to advance his empire's interests. Simply exposing your deception publicly would certainly cause chaos in Egypt, but it might also rally the Egyptian people around their pharaoh in defiance of foreign interference. Instead, Khasatid-in-Lil chose a more subtle approach: blackmail. He would use his knowledge to force concessions from Egypt, weakening the kingdom gradually, while maintaining plausible deniability for his own empire's involvement. The blackmail began subtly, with seemingly reasonable requests for trade concessions that you found yourself unable to refuse. The Hittite spy never explicitly stated his knowledge of your secret, but his implications were clear enough that you understood the threat. Egypt began making agreements that heavily favored Mesopotamian interests, granting trading rights that compromised Egyptian economic advantages and reducing tariffs that protected local industries. Your closest advisor, Senin, was the first to recognize the pattern of forced concessions. A brilliant architect and administrator who had served you faithfully for 2 decades, Senin was one of only 3 people who knew the truth about your gender, and he understood immediately what was happening. Someone knows our secret. These trade negotiations are not really negotiations. They're surrender terms disguised as commerce. How much do you think they know? Enough to destroy us, and probably enough to prove it, or they wouldn't dare attempt blackmail against the Pharaoh of Egypt. The situation was further complicated by the growing restlessness of Thutmose III, who had spent his entire adult life waiting to claim the throne that was legally his birthright. Now 30 years old and an accomplished military commander, he had begun to attract support from nobles and priests who believed that Egypt needed a more traditionally masculine pharaoh to face the growing threats from neighboring empires. Thutmose III had never openly challenged your authority, but palace informants reported that he had been meeting privately with military leaders and high priests. Discussions that could only mean he was considering a bid for power. If the Hittite blackmail continued to weaken Egypt's position, while Thutmose III's support grew stronger, you could find yourself facing a war on 2 fronts: external pressure from foreign enemies and internal rebellion from your own people. You spent sleepless nights walking the palace corridors, weighing your options. You could continue submitting to the blackmail, gradually allowing Egypt's power to erode until the kingdom became a vassal state of more aggressive neighbors. You could attempt to have Enlil assassinated, but his death would likely trigger the very exposure you were trying to prevent. Or you could take the most dangerous path of all, reveal your secret yourself on your own terms, and face whatever consequences followed. The decision came to you during the festival of Opite, when you were required to appear before thousands of your subjects in the most sacred ceremony of the Egyptian religious calendar, standing in the great temple at Karnak, wearing the traditional regalia of pharaonic power. You looked out at the sea of faces, nobles and commoners, priests and soldiers, men and women who had prospered under your rule for over 2 decades. These were your people, and you had served them faithfully, but you had also built that service on a foundation of deception. Every decision you had made, every policy you had implemented, every moment of leadership you had provided had been shadowed by the love of your supposed masculinity. During the ceremony, as you performed the traditional rituals that connected the pharaoh to the gods, you felt a clarity you hadn't experienced in years. The gods, you realized, had never required you to be male to serve Egypt effectively. That was a human limitation, a cultural assumption that had been allowed to override the evidence of your successful reign. After the public ceremony, you convened a secret meeting with your most trusted advisors, Sunanmort, Hapasineb, the high priest, and Nehesi, the chancellor. These 3 men had been your closest collaborators throughout your reign, and their loyalty had never wavered, despite the enormous risks they had taken in supporting your deception. The blackmail will continue, you told them simply. Our enemies now know they can manipulate Egypt by threatening to expose our secret, and each concession we make only encourages greater demands. We cannot continue to sacrifice our kingdom's interests to protect a lie, but the alternative is to face the chaos that will follow when the truth is revealed. The priests will claim that your reign has been illegitimate, that every decision you've made has been invalid. The nobles will demand that Thutmose III be installed immediately as the rightful pharaoh. The people may feel betrayed and deceived. Some will, you agreed, but others may judge me by my actions rather than my gender. Egypt has prospered under my rule. We have built magnificent temples, expanded trade, maintained peace, and preserved the kingdom's strength. If I have ruled well, does it matter that I am a woman? The question is not whether you have ruled well, but whether the people and nobility will accept a female pharaoh once the deception is revealed. Egyptian tradition is clear about male succession, and challenging that tradition could destabilize the entire kingdom. Egyptian tradition, you replied, also includes Ma'at, the principle of truth and justice. I have lived a lie for 22 years, and that lie is now being used to harm Egypt. Perhaps it is time to trust in Ma'at and reveal the truth, whatever the consequences. Your decision to reveal your secret was not made impulsively, but it was implemented with the same careful planning that had characterized your entire reign. You understood that the manner of revelation would be crucial to its acceptance. A clumsy or defensive announcement could indeed trigger the chaos that your advisors feared, while a confident and well-reasoned explanation might allow you to maintain power even after the truth was known. The revelation began with a series of private meetings with key figures in Egyptian society: high priests, military commanders, provincial governors, and wealthy merchants whose support would be essential for maintaining stability. To each group, you presented the same argument. Your gender was less important than your effectiveness as a ruler, and Egypt's continued prosperity depended on maintaining the policies and leadership that had brought 22 years of peace and abundance. The reactions were mixed, but generally more positive than you had dared hope. Most of the people you told were shocked, but their shock was tempered by their recognition of your successful reign. Some expressed concern about the religious implications of female rule, but others pointed out that several goddesses, including Isis and Hathor, held positions of supreme power in the Egyptian pantheon. The military commanders were particularly supportive, noting that your policies had kept Egypt strong without requiring costly wars that would have drained the kingdom's resources and cost thousands of lives. The most difficult conversation was with Thutmose III himself. Now in his 30s, and the father of his own children, he had spent his entire adult life in the shadow of the pharaoh who had technically been serving as his regent. Learning that this pharaoh was actually his stepmother, who had been ruling in her own right, rather than in his name, forced him to reconsider his entire understanding of his position and prospects. I should be angry, he said after you had finished explaining the situation. You have denied me my birthright for over 20 years, ruling a kingdom that should have been mine by right of succession. You should be angry, you agreed, but I hope you will also consider what Egypt has gained during those 20 years and what it might lose if we allow our enemies to use our domestic conflicts to weaken the kingdom. Thutmose III was quiet for a long time, studying the woman who had shaped his entire life while remaining a mystery to him. You have ruled well, he finally admitted. Egypt is stronger and more prosperous than it was when my father died. I cannot argue with the results of your leadership. But, you prompted, but the kingdom needs to know that its succession is stable and legitimate. The nobles need to believe that royal bloodlines matter, and the people need to trust that their pharaoh rules by divine right. Your deception, however well-intentioned, has created questions about legitimacy that could persist for generations. The public revelation of your gender was planned as carefully as any military campaign, rather than a single dramatic announcement that might trigger panic or rebellion. The truth was revealed gradually through a series of statements and demonstrations designed to emphasize continuity rather than change. The process began with a special ceremony at the Temple of Amun-Re, where you appeared before the assembled priests and nobility, wearing traditional pharaonic regalia, but without the false beard that had been part of your public image for 2 decades. The change was subtle enough that many observers didn't immediately notice, but significant enough to signal that something important was happening. In your address to the assembly, you spoke about the challenges facing Egypt and the need for unity in the face of external threats. You revealed the Hittite blackmail plot, explaining how enemies of Egypt had been trying to use internal divisions to weaken the kingdom. Only at the end of your speech did you directly address the question of your gender. For 22 years, you said, your voice carrying clearly through the temple, you have judged your pharaoh by the prosperity of Egypt, the strength of our military, the magnificence of our monuments, and the security of our borders. These achievements were not accomplished by the false beard of kingship or the ceremonial regalia of pharaonic power, but by the wisdom of good governance, the courage of decisive leadership, and the blessing of the gods who care more about effective rule than about the gender of the ruler. The reaction was immediate and intense, but not as chaotic as your advisors had feared. Some priests declared that female rule was contrary to Moat and demanded that Thutmose III be installed immediately as pharaoh. Others argued that the gods had clearly blessed your reign, as evidenced by Egypt's unprecedented prosperity, and that challenging your authority would be an offense against divine will. The military response was crucial, and you had prepared for it carefully. Your personal bodyguard, commanded by officers who had served you faithfully for years, remained loyal and maintained order in the capital. More importantly, the commanders of Egypt's major garrisons had been briefed privately before the public announcement, and most expressed continued support for your leadership. The people's reaction was perhaps the most surprising. While some expressed shock and confusion, many seemed more interested in practical concerns than in questions of gender. "Has she kept us fed?" asked one farmer. "Have the taxes been fair?" wondered a merchant. "Are we at peace with our neighbors?" inquired a craftsman. For most ordinary Egyptians, the effectiveness of their pharaoh's rule mattered more than the traditional gender expectations of royalty. The most serious threat to your continued rule came not from popular uprising or foreign invasion, but from within the royal court itself. A faction of high priests and nobles, led by Amenemheb, the high priest of Ptah, declared that your 22-year reign had been illegitimate from the beginning, and that all your official acts were therefore invalid. This challenge was particularly dangerous because it struck at the legal and religious foundations of Egyptian society. If your reign was declared illegitimate, then every treaty you had signed, every law you had promulgated, and every appointment you had made could be challenged. The resulting legal chaos could paralyze the government and leave Egypt vulnerable to its enemies. Amenemheb's faction argued that Egyptian law was clear. Only men could serve as pharaoh, and no amount of effective governance could override this fundamental requirement. They demanded that Thutmose III be crowned immediately as the rightful pharaoh, with your entire reign declared null and void. "The gods have established order in the world," Amenheb declared in a formal address to the royal court. "Men rule kingdoms, women bear children, priests serve the temples, and farmers work the land. When this natural order is disturbed, chaos follows. Egypt has been living a lie for 22 years, and now we face the consequences of that deception." Your response was both political and theological. You pointed out that several goddesses held supreme power in the Egyptian pantheon, including Isis, who was often depicted wearing the pharaonic crown. You noted that Egypt's prosperity under your rule suggested divine approval rather than divine disapproval, and you challenged your opponents to explain how a reign blessed by the gods could be considered illegitimate simply because of the gender of the ruler. The debate raged for weeks, with scholars, priests, and legal experts citing precedents, interpreting religious texts, and arguing about the fundamental nature of pharaonic authority. The conflict was not just about your right to rule, but about the entire structure of Egyptian society and the relationship between human law and divine will. The resolution came from an unexpected source, Thutmose III himself. In a carefully crafted statement, he acknowledged that you had ruled effectively and that Egypt had prospered under your leadership, while he maintained his own claim to the throne. As the legitimate heir of Thutmose II, he proposed a compromise that would preserve stability while respecting traditional succession. Let Hatshepsut continue to rule as pharaoh for the remainder of her natural life, but let it be understood that I will succeed her upon her death, and that my own heirs will inherit the throne according to traditional law. In this way, we honor both the effectiveness of her leadership and the legitimacy of royal succession. The compromise proposed by Thutmose III was accepted by most factions, though not without significant negotiation and modification. You would continue as pharaoh, but with Thutmose III formally recognized as your heir and successor. This arrangement satisfied those who demanded respect for traditional succession, while allowing Egypt to continue benefiting from proven leadership. The agreement also included provisions designed to prevent future succession crises. A council of regents was established to oversee the transition of power. Detailed succession laws were codified to cover unusual circumstances, and procedures were created for handling situations where the traditional male line of succession was interrupted. More importantly, the compromise allowed Egypt to present a united front against external threats. The Hittite blackmail scheme collapsed when it became clear that you were revealing your secret voluntarily rather than being forced to submit to foreign pressure. Kasai-Enlil, the Mesopotamian spy who had initiated the blackmail, found himself without leverage and was quietly expelled from Egypt, with a warning that any further interference would be considered an act of war. The revelation of your gender had international implications beyond the immediate blackmail scheme. Foreign rulers who had dealt with Egypt for decades were forced to reconsider their assumptions about Egyptian society and leadership. Some expressed admiration for a kingdom that could maintain such stability despite having a female ruler. Others saw the situation as evidence of Egyptian weakness and began probing for opportunities to exploit perceived vulnerability. Domestically, the transition to acknowledged female rule required adjustments throughout Egyptian society. Court protocols were modified to accommodate a female pharaoh. Religious ceremonies were adapted to include feminine aspects of divine authority, and legal precedents were established for future cases involving female leadership. The changes were not merely cosmetic. You, no longer constrained by the need to maintain a masculine facade, were able to govern more naturally and effectively. Your policies began to reflect perspectives that might have been suppressed during your years of gender deception, including greater attention to social welfare, increased support for arts and education, and more emphasis on diplomatic solutions to international conflict. You ruled for 3 more years after the revelation of your gender, years that were marked by continued prosperity and stability. Your example paved the way for other capable women to assume leadership roles in Egyptian society, though none would achieve the supreme position of pharaoh for many centuries. When you died, at the age of 57, you were mourned throughout Egypt as one of the greatest pharaohs in the kingdom's history. Your funeral was attended by representatives from throughout the ancient world, many of whom had come to respect your leadership despite their initial shock at learning of your gender. Thutmose III, who succeeded you as planned, proved to be a capable ruler in his own right, though his reign was marked by more military campaigns and territorial expansion than yours had been. He never attempted to diminish your legacy or erase evidence of your reign, understanding that your success had strengthened rather than weakened the institution of pharaonic rule. The most lasting impact of your revelation was the precedent it established for evaluating leaders based on their effectiveness, rather than their conformity to traditional expectations. While Egypt would continue to prefer male pharaohs for many centuries, the principle that competent governance mattered more than gender identity became part of Egyptian political philosophy. The temple complex at Deir el-Bahari, which you built as your mortuary temple, remains one of the most magnificent examples of Egyptian architecture. Its unique design, combining traditional pharaonic grandeur with innovative architectural elements, serves as a fitting monument to a ruler who combined respect for tradition with the courage to challenge conventional limitation. In the end, your story became more than just the tale of a woman who ruled as pharaoh. It became a testament to the power of effective leadership to transcend social boundaries and the importance of truth, even when that truth is inconvenient or challenging to accepted norms. Your reign proved that the qualities that make a great leader, wisdom, courage, compassion, and dedication to the common good, have nothing to do with gender and everything to do with character. You showed the world that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in conforming to expectations, but in having the courage to be who you truly are when it matters most. The secret you carried for 22 years nearly destroyed you, but the truth you finally revealed transformed not just Egypt, but the entire ancient world's understanding of what leadership could be. And perhaps that's the most powerful legacy any pharaoh could leave behind.